Alright! And this is Wednesday, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard, Discussions of Truth. We are now streaming live at stopmassmedia.com. We have transitioned from Winwood Radio, continuing a strong relationship with them, but now streaming live Wednesdays, again, at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard at stopmassmedia.com. Tell your friends. All right, so we are closing out the month of February, and what a year it has shaped up to be. We started Discuss Your Truth in 2020 with Jordan Maxwell, who is now 80 years old. He's an American historian, if you will, and has an incredible background, really, on understanding not only the history of the United States, but more how it has folded from the European foundation that it was built on, if you will. That's something that is very important to consider when considering the state of the United States. Of the country today, the United States, and how basically a common phrase in regards to Donald Trump, the current chief executive officer of the United States Corporation, if you will, has come to power. Okay, and last week we had a fascinating discussion with Dr. Bandy X. Lee of Yale University, Yale Medical School, and Bandy brought to table, and she's a New York Times bestselling author. The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump is the book that she wrote. A leading violence expert and forensic psychiatrist. She's the president of she is a founder, I believe, of the World Mental Health Coalition. She's quoted as saying, "We are speaking out at this time because we are convinced that as the time of possible impeachment approaches, Donald Trump has the real potential to become ever more dangerous, a threat to the safety of our nation." Okay, and that certainly extends to the globe, because a man who is so close, 20 seconds I think is the official count, something like that, to launching any type of nuclear weapon or assault, that can be a very dangerous situation. Okay, and so Dr. Lee, a well-trained psychiatrist, is basically coming out and saying that he's not mentally capable of sustaining that type of position. He's mentally unfit. He has a mental illness, is her argument. And so she's sounding the alarm across the nation for Americans. If you're American, and certainly if you're non-American, if you're living elsewhere, you need to be very interested in Donald Trump. And what I basically am circling back to is that he is the symptom. Okay, so today's guest, who's rejoining the program, will reveal his understanding and research on the voting system. Is the voting system rigged in the United States? And that is nothing to take lightly, because a republic that's built on democratic values needs to take the right, if you will, to vote very seriously. Very, very seriously. It's a very serious opportunity, if you will, that is not extended in other parts of the globe. So, the dangerous case of Donald Trump. And we followed, it was last week with Bandy Lee, and we followed that up with a Lindstroth report, JP Lindstroth. If you enjoy catching the broadcasts via iTunes or Spotify podcast platform, you will have noticed there was an audio glitch in that episode. So, what we were doing here at Discuss Your Truth is rescheduling, and Dr. Lee has graciously accepted the invitation to rejoin the program, and that will be happening in April. Most likely, unofficially, that date is now going to be set at April 8th, 5 p.m. She joins us at the 15-minute mark of that hour. 5:15 p.m. Eastern Standard on April 8th is the projected date to bring Dr. Lee back to the program. Okay, as we all know, Donald Trump was impeached. However, he was not removed from office. Next week, we're starting the new year off with, or excuse me, the new month off. New year, suppose? No, leap year. We're starting off March with former CIA agent Kevin Shipp. The U.S. Constitution and the inalienable human rights that it supports are in grave danger. Okay, you must know that. He was born in Wyoming. Kevin Shipp's a former high-ranking CIA agent. In 2020, he had no problem holding the people we allow to occupy United States government seats accountable for what they represent and how they may be corrupting and or preventing that privilege. Again, our politicians are holding their political assignment because of a privilege. We have put them there. That means you represent them and you have the power to remove them. That's something that we seem to be struggling with in this country. The shadow government is a system, this is a quote from Kevin, the shadow government is a system that manipulates Washington, D.C. behind the scenes, that operates beyond the control of Congress, that even dictates the actions of the president and affects the daily lives of every American. Do you see that becoming a reality? And this is a quote that I don't know what the year is, but this is a few years old. And again, I said Donald Trump is a symptom. He's a symptom and a cause, but he's a symptom of the state of the union, if you will. The corruption that has been allowed to infiltrate not only politics. Of course, it trickles down to politics, but it starts on a higher level. The corporations that operate the politics, basically. Anyway, so continuing that quote, it is real and has been growing in complexity, Kevin says, for over 60 years. While the American people work long hours just to survive and make ends meet, the shadow government spends billions of dollars on secret operations, overthrowing governments, and engaging in covert wars that kill thousands, all without any vote or say by the American people, who, of course, represent those tax dollars. The people pay the taxes the shadow government uses to fund the operations. The people starve while the kings shower themselves in gold. And in fact, the guest will be joining us here in a few moments is working on a 10 series, 10 installment series books that he is working on. And the next installment will actually be on the middle class. Today he'll be addressing voting, and I will reveal his name. If you haven't caught on to that already, I will read that in a few moments. All right, so Kevin Shipp will be joining the program to start out March, continuing into March 11th. William Alva Blunden, Cornell-educated, San Francisco State University lecturer and author, going to be bringing to the table a discussion on his understanding of the dark areas of the internet, the rootkit arsenal, escape and evasion in the dark corners of the system. In his other book, Behold a Pale Farce, Cyber War, Threat, Inflation, and the Malware Industrial Complex. There is an industrial complex, okay? And the military industrial complex is a phrase that you've likely heard before. It's a very real problem, okay? It's a very real problem. What are its lines that are trickling down and flowing through, the veins that are flowing through which bodies, is really the question of what is a deep state. You can start with trying to dissect the Federal Reserve. Good luck with that, because it's never audited and there's nothing federal about it. All right. Now, as far as Silicon Valley goes, yes, it's a corporate atmosphere where new technologies are spun from old technologies, and there's innovation all the time happening from the World Wide Web protocol and platform that was invented in CERN in what was early 80s. Don't quote me on that. Okay, Tim Berners-Lee, I believe is his name. I should know that because it's basically a pioneer of the internet. But of course, the internet predated him and various parts of the internet. So yes, the internet as we know it, Instagram, Facebook, and all these kind of surface companies that have spun off of the deeper kind of hidden military communication platform are a very real aspect of life. But really, what does Silicon Valley represent? Yes, it represents the military-industrial complex. Absolutely. There's no question about that, okay? There's absolutely no question about it. So we're really discussing what Bill Blunden is working on there at San Francisco State. And he'll be joining us again March 11th. The 18th of March, Sabotage, the Hidden Nature of Finance. London School of Economics professor Anastasia Nesvetalova and Ronan Palin will be joining the program to discuss, again, their book, Sabotage, and we'll be closing out March with A. Ralph Epperson. El Nuevo Orden Mundial is what he'll be talking about, the prospect of a new world order. What is it? How long has it been in play? Really, what is it? What does it mean? Why is it on the back of the dollar bill? Okay, and then we're going to be getting into April with Google whistleblower Zach Voorhees. That'll be April 1st, and as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be rejoined by Dr. Lee in April, and then Gerald Posner will be joining us, and he's written a book called Pharma. He's won 3 New York Times bestselling books. Gerald Posner is a former Wall Street attorney, educated at Cal Berkeley, and just before we bring Thom on, Thom Hartmann's joining us today. I want to actually address something in Pharma. Pharma is not released yet. I think it's coming out in March. I've been fortunate enough. Simon Schuster has sent me a copy. So I do have a copy of the book, and in front of me it's 800 pages of incredibly meticulously well documented, researched history on the pharmaceutical industry in the United States and just how incredibly disgustingly corrupt it is. But let me give you the idea of the substance that it contains. And this is not a direct quote, but a direct kind of paraphrase. A milestone decision by the FDA in the 1960s led the agency to miss all early evidence of antibiotic drug resistance. Okay, so if you even get into the pharmaceutical industry, the medical industry, yes, there are very many levels of corruption within it. Absolutely, there's no doubt about that. Do we all need medicine? Absolutely, yes, we do. Do we need to go to the hospital? Yes, these are important things. Do we need to be vaccinated? Yes, we do. Are there real threats out there? Yes, there are. Is there corruption that's a total other tier of threat? Yes, absolutely. Okay, so continuing. The paraphrase, creating the opening to superbugs. Okay, the ruling in the 60s by the FDA created an opening to superbugs that today sickens 3 million Americans annually and kills an estimated 50,000. Okay, Discuss Your Truth. I opened the program with Seek and Destroy. It's a Metallica, California-based rock group, and basically why I choose that song is because all of us, you listening, everyone out there, we all have the power to seek out and destroy corruption on whatever level it may permeate through our life. It's up to you. Okay, it's up to you to make a change, and that's why I began this program now in its fourth year. Okay, so today we will be discussing with Thom Hartmann the hidden history of the war on voting. Who stole your vote and how to get it back? Progressive Voice Network David Bender, the political director, said this about the book. In this timely and important book, Thom Hartmann challenges us to fight for our fundamental right as American citizens to vote. A right that is not guaranteed in the Constitution, but should be, good point, for far too long, the basic principle of our democratic republic has been under constant attack, largely by corporate interests that literally profit from voter suppression. This book is an indispensable manual for waging and winning civic warfare. Use it. And talk show host Stephanie Miller said this: is Thom Hartmann psychic or what? His book on voting is eerily prescient and right on time, as usual. We are in election year, folks. A grateful nation thanks you, Tom. We are in an election year, and again, I don't take sides politically. I think, frankly, both, regardless of various stances, both parties are totally corrupt, is my opinion. Lawrence Lessig was on the program a few weeks ago, a Harvard Law professor, and I think both sides have very valid arguments, but I believe that the corporations that control the politicians, for a large part, are completely corrupt, and so we've got other issues on hand. But do we still have a right to vote? Well, I guess that depends on who you are. Dialing in Thom Hartmann, thanks for listening today. Thanks for re-listening. IanTrottier.com. Donate. Buy the shirt. No More Lies. StopMassMedia.com. It's coming out in April. April 23rd, I believe, is the day. You can pre-order the book right now on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and various other retail outlets throughout Australia, the UK, and Canada, and Europe, Denmark. All right. Dialing in Thom Hartmann.
Hello?
Thom Hartmann.
That's me.
Excellent. This is Ian Trottier. Welcome back, sir, to Discussions of Truth. Excellent to have you back on the program as we talk about your second installment, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, of a 10-book series, The Hidden History of the War on Voting.
It's the third. Thank you.
The third. Okay, good. You're welcome.
Guns and the Supreme Court, and this is voting.
Say that again, Tom, please.
We did guns and the Second Amendment, and then we did the Supreme Court and the betrayal of America, and now we're doing this one. This book is on voting.
Excellent. Yeah, and not to jump the gun here, but your next installment is going to be on the middle class. Is that correct?
That's right. Monopoly and the Destruction of the American Dream.
Fantastic. Looking very forward to that one. So, Tom, break it down here for us a little bit. I think the average American realizes and knows that that there's a problem with voting across the country, and unfortunately, I feel, Tom, that most Americans simply feel like they cannot make a change, and hence, when it comes to the opportunity to vote, they say, "Well, my vote's not going to count, so I'm simply just not going to go to the poll." How do you feel about that, Tom? And of course, that doesn't really have much to do with your book. But what are your thoughts on that comment, Tom? And tell us exactly what's going on in your mind in regards to the voting platform in this country today.
Well, the fact of the matter is that your vote does count, and it is important. And not going to the polls is, particularly for Democrats, is essentially voting for Republicans. And generations of Americans have fought, and in many cases died, to get you that right, regardless of who you are and what your heritage is.
Well said.
And so to dismiss it that way, so callously, I think is if nothing else, unpatriotic. And actually, not a good thing. It's not a good thing for you. It's not a good thing for democracy. There are constantly more obstacles being put up to vote by Republican races and Republican governors in state after state. They reduce the number of polling places. They shorten the number of early voting days. They make it harder to vote by mail. They try to say that you can't vote if you're a felon and you haven't paid your fines. I mean, any little thing that they can find to deny your vote. What's so bizarre about this is that if the state of Florida or the state of Massachusetts or the state of anything, any 50 state wanted to take away your gun, they would have to go to court. They'd have to jump through all sorts of legal hoops. It would be appealable, but they would have to go to court and prove that you were a danger to yourself or others. And in some states, that's even a whole lot harder than it sounds. But in every single state, they would have to jump through all these hoops because the Supreme Court has said that there is an individual right to own a gun. The Supreme Court, on the other hand, in the Bush v. Gore case in 2000, said there is no right to vote in the Constitution. And therefore, any Secretary of State and this is universal among the Republican states, can take away your vote and not even tell you, not even justify it. They don't even have to give a reason. They just take away your vote. And that's got to change. We really need to have a right to vote in the United States. I mean, that's just kind of flat out nuts.
So, Thom, let me piggyback on that kind of comment that I threw out there, and I think you would agree. It sounds like you may agree with it, and that there seems to be a notion across the country that, oh, my vote's not going to count, and you're bringing up the point that I was hoping you'd make, and that your vote does count, and you can make a change, and you need any listener needs to get out there. You need to, this election year, you need to get out there. You need to make a vote. Do not let do not let the powers that be or the mystique of, oh, my vote's not going to count. Do you feel, Thom, that is a mechanical design, perhaps, by various groups to kind of suppress the vote? Is that by design? Is that a reflection of some type of design out there?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been suppressing the vote since the founding of the Republic. There were some states in which you had to be a property owner to vote. There were some states in the northern states. You had states in the first 20 years of the Republic where you actually had people of color and women voting. By the 1830s, by the end of Jackson's presidency, every state had banned women from voting, and most states had banned people of color from voting, even in the North. And then after the failure of Reconstruction in the late 1870s, once again in the South and in some northern states as well, and some middle like Missouri, again it became impossible for black people to vote. In some cases, they had fancy rationalizations like, we couldn't pass the literacy test or couldn't pay the poll tax. In other states, they would just terrorize people. The Klan would come riding through the day before the election. If you were seen going to the polls, you'd be shot. Destruction is at the heart of the history of America, and the Republican Party is carrying on that tradition in the most aggressive way that they possibly can.
Yeah. So, Thom, we hosted Lawrence Lessig a few weeks ago. He's a presidential candidate, Democratic Party in 2016. He spoke about gerrymandering. And said there's a major problem in regards to that, which kind of brings up an interesting point in regards to money, and some of these campaigns. And if you have any comment on this, some of these campaigns, would it make a difference if they were publicly funded rather than privately funded?
Yeah, hugely. I mean, there's really two issues here. One is gerrymandering and voter suppression are examples of when the elected officials are choosing their voters, whereas our system was designed for it to be the other way around. But in addition to gerrymandering and voter suppression, you've got just the process of voting. And I'm sorry, Ian, I'm driving. I just got distracted. Repeat the last half of your question, please.
Yeah. So what I was basically getting at is through your research and your opinion, looking at private funding of individual campaigns versus public funding. Yeah,
public funding of elections. Yeah. Well, and that's a separate issue, but a really huge one. In 1976, we had through 1975 coming out of the Church Commission and other congressional investigations and actions after the Nixon scandals of '74. President Gerald Ford signed some of the most comprehensive legislation that we've ever had to get money out of politics. And, it worked. And this is not new. I mean, the first major effort to do this was in 1807 when Teddy Roosevelt got the Tillman Act passed, which made it a felony for any corporation to give money to any candidate for public office, for federal public office. And but in 1976, after Lewis Powell had been put on the court by Nixon in '72, And this was Powell's thing, was get money back into politics, let rich people basically run the country. Thus the Powell memo. In '76, in a decision called Buckley versus Bellotti, the Supreme Court ruled that if an individual wanted to run for public office using their own money, which is what Woodward and Sayer are doing, there are literally no rules. They don't have to, the Federal Election Commission has no control over them, because that's considered, their money is considered free speech, and it's their money, so it's their speech, and they can do whatever they damn well please with it. And that if a billionaire wants to own a politician, to contribute so much money that they basically, that politician owes their political life to this person and only votes the way that person wants. We used to call that bribery and corruption. Under the '76 Supreme Court decision, that is now considered free speech as well. 2 years later, in the First National Bank versus Bellotti decision, the Supreme Court extended that logic to corporations. And that led in '79 and '80 to an absolute ocean of cash pouring into the Republican Party. The Democratic Party was doing just fine with all the union money. A third of America was unionized. There was so much money sloshing around in the unions that Jimmy Hoffa was stealing it. But so the Democratic Party pretty much ignored these two decisions. But the Republican Party said, "Cool, we're for sale. Here's the sign." And big industries and big billionaires joined the Republican Party. Now, by '92, the Republican war on unions had been quite successful. They'd knocked about half the unions in the United States in the private sector out of business, or weakened them so much they couldn't support Democratic candidates anymore. And so Bill Clinton had to start doing what Republicans had been doing in the '92 election, taking money from corporations and billionaires. And so the billionaires he picked were people like Jamie Dimon, these big bankers, and the corporations. He wanted it to be, jobs of the future, white-collar jobs. So it was banks and pharmaceutical companies and health insurance companies, all came to basically own the Democratic Party. And now, for the first time in this election cycle, we're actually starting to see the Democratic Party walk back to its FDR and LBJ Great Society, genuine progressive roots. I mean, there's literally not a single policy that Bernie Sanders is proposing that wasn't at one point or another proposed by either Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, or Lyndon Johnson, or Jack Kennedy. Every single one of them, including Medicare for all.
Interesting.
So,
go ahead.
It's not like he's some kind of radical. He's just taking the party back to its roots.
Right. And going with FDR, my understanding is that he put an emphasis on education, which doesn't seem to exist today in the United States. And correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but he seemed to take the stance that education should be a right.
FDR in 1945, I think it was, might have been late 44, gave a speech called the Second Bill of Rights speech, in which he proposed that we should actually amend the Constitution and make healthcare a right, which means the government would have to make sure you had it one way or another. Make education a right, including college, which would mean that the government would have to make sure you had it one way or another. Make a job that pays enough that a single person can support a family anywhere in the country a right, which would mean that the government would have to make sure that happened. And make housing a right. This was his Second Bill of Rights. And again, Bernie's not even proposing stuff that radical. And he was loved for that. Now, he died and never got a chance to implement it. Harry Truman picked it up and tried to push through the single-payer health care, in Medicare for all. It did not succeed. It was blocked by Republicans in the Congress. But that's the legacy of the Democratic Party. Those are the true values of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, beautiful.
And it just pains me so much to hear these so-called moderate Democrats say, "Oh, that's radical stuff. Nobody will go for that." Oh, Franklin Roosevelt got elected president 4 times.
I believe FDR actually had an assassination attempt on him at Biscayne Park there in Miami. But Tom, I think you talked about felonies and during the Bush-Gore years, talk about this a little bit, if you would. Something about felons unable to vote in Florida being shipped. Is this true, Tom? Being shipped to Texas so they could vote?
No, it's the other way around. What happened was George Bush was the governor of Texas, and Jeb Bush was the governor of Florida. And George was running for president. So George provided a list to Jeb of all the felons in Texas. Now, the overwhelming majority of felons in Texas are either black or Hispanic. And black people and Hispanic people have a relatively small number of last names. Most black people are either named after a president. Most of the Washingtons, Jacksons, Jeffersons in America are black people, or their names came from plantation owners, and those are all Anglo-Saxon names. They're all English, language names, relatively small name pool. Hispanic people, all their names are all derived from Spanish. So again, a relatively small name pool. So when you take whereas white people, Caucasians, have a huge name pool. We've got names from Russian and from Greek and from Swedish and, all kinds of languages. So when you take a list that's almost all black and Hispanic people, the Texas felon list, and you compare it with the Florida voter list, and you assert, and you don't even check middle names, you just look at first and last names, and you assert that anybody whose name is on both lists is a Texas felon who has moved to Florida to illegally vote in the Florida election, which bars felons from voting in Florida, which is the assertion that Jeb Bush made. They succeeded in knocking 90,000 African Americans and Hispanics off the voting rolls in Florida in the months just before the 2000 election. And of course, George W. Bush supposedly won that election by 527 votes. The problem that they had was that the BBC did some investigative reporting, and in February and March of 2001, after George was sworn in, they broke this story all over the world, and it got into the American media as well. And then you had, through April, May, June, and July, throughout the summer, you had people, huge protests, tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, in one case, in the streets in Florida protesting this. You had people talking about George W. Bush had an illegitimate presidency, that the election was stolen. And the NAACP and the ACLU both sued both Jeb Bush and George Bush in court. And George's favorability ratings as a result of this collapsed. It was down around 35%. It was lower than any president except for Nixon. And the way that George got out of this was 9/11 happened, and everybody just kind of forgot about what was going on. But the Republicans said, hey, this really works really well. If we can take a list that's got a lot of black people on it and compare it with a state voting list, it's going to knock most of the black people off that state voting list. And so they were looking at the various state elections. But they didn't want to do it in such an obvious way that people would say, oh, wait a minute, this election was stolen, like they did in 2000.
Yeah.
So in 2002, they passed a piece of legislation called the Help America Vote Act, which created a new kind of ballot. It's called a provisional ballot. And whether a provisional ballot is counted is entirely up to the Secretary of State. And so they started taking, for example, Michigan took the Georgia voter roll. Georgia's almost half black, their population. Michigan took the Georgia voter roll, and compared it to the Michigan voter roll. And of course, there were tens of thousands, in fact, there were over 180,000 matches between the Georgia voter roll and people living in Detroit and Flint, mostly black people. And so the result of that was, Michigan was Rick Snyder was able to knock almost 200,000 people off the voting rolls just before the 2016 election, which, of course, Donald Trump won by 17,000 votes. And this was being done in state after state. A guy named Chris Kobach was organizing this. It was called Interstate Crosscheck, where they would take states with large black populations and compare them with other states and knock off basically all the black people. And this is why, if you look on page 92 of my book, you'll see that,
right.
If you actually look at the exit polls, because people, when they get a provisional ballot, they think they voted. So they walk out and tell the exit pollster, I just voted for Hillary. That, Hillary won Pennsylvania, won Florida, won North Carolina, won Wisconsin. I mean, by 5 and 6 points. But that's how many people had voted on provisional ballots, and those provisional ballots in red states are literally not even opened unless there's a lawsuit.
Uh-huh. And this alludes to something called the red shift. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's when the exit polls. I mean, we used to use, in the 80s and 90s, in the election of 1980, 84, 86, 92, 96, and 2000. In every single one of those elections, exit polls were used to call the election. And in the 2000 election, when the exit poll showed that Al Gore won Florida by about 80,000 votes, which was, by the way, the number of black people that Jeb pushed off the voting rolls. When that showed up, suddenly the exit polls didn't work anymore, and everybody was baffled. And because they use exit polls all across Europe, we took down the government of Ukraine in the 2004 election because the exit polls showed that the guy who was aligned with Europe won, but the official results showed that the guy aligned with Russia won. and the Orange Revolution happened. 1 million people were in the streets that day. So, exit polls are like the gold standard. Every other country uses them. In Canada, all across Europe, they all vote on paper. It takes 3 to 4 days to count. We just saw this in the UK with the Boris Johnson election. It took 4 days to count the vote, but they called the election the night of the election based on the exit polls. The United States is literally the only country in the world where exit polls don't regularly match within 1% or less with the official results. And that only happens in states with Republican secretaries of state, and it almost always happens. There have been 1 or 2 outliers, but I think you could safely say it always happens where the exit polls show a Democrat winning, but the official results show a Republican winning. That's called red shift because it's shifting toward the Republican Party. There literally is no such thing as blue shift in the United States.
Now, in part 1 of your book...
And this is all possible because we don't have a right to vote. Excuse me.
No, that's right. In part 1 of your book, you talk about the Electoral College and how that's supposed to weed out, if you will, that's my term, of course, not yours, people like a Donald Trump from getting into the office. Help listeners understand a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, when they were putting together the Constitution in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, this was in July, actually, this part of the debate, they came to the presidency, and the question was, this is a position that is sort of the pseudo-king position. This person is going to be commander-in-chief of the military. They're going to have tremendous power. They're going to have pardon power. They're going to have veto power. So how do we, at that point in time, in 1787, the United States was geographically the largest Western country in the world. I mean, we were massively larger than most of the European countries. You could fit half of Europe in the eastern seaboard, or a chunk of Europe. And so the question was, if somebody's running for president, and they're mostly running in Washington, D.C., how does somebody in Vermont or in New Hampshire or in Georgia or in South Carolina have any idea if this is a person of sound mind or reasonable character?
Sure.
Or more importantly, somebody who might be under the influence of a foreign government? And that was the biggest fear that they had, frankly. Yeah. And so what they came up with was something based on what the Iroquois Confederacy did, where each community in the Iroquois Confederacy would basically find the most, the wise elder of the community, the person that everybody trusted, the person that was nonpartisan, the person that, everybody respected. And they would send them once a year off to these giant meetings, the Gemeinschafts, they were called. And so they took that concept and they said, let's create a college of wise elders. And these wise elders will be told by their community what the community's preference is. We'd like you to vote for George Bush or Al Gore, but they don't actually have to vote that way because because their job is to go to Washington, D.C. and get to personally know the candidates. And if they discover that one is, to quote Alexander Hamilton, in the thrall of a foreign government, or to quote George Mason, a drunkard, and a person of low morals, then they could change their vote. And that was supposed to be the safety valve. And actually, that makes a lot of sense, given the state of communications. I mean, we didn't have any national newspapers then. This was before telegraph or any of this kind of stuff, in the 1770s. By the 1830s, it was no longer really necessary and largely irrelevant. And in fact, in 1974, Indiana Senator Birch Bayh proposed that we by constitutional amendment, take the Electoral College out of the Constitution. It passed the House with a 2/3 majority, and it was only 2 votes short in the Senate. It nearly passed, but the Republicans were opposed to it. Now they're loving the Electoral College because if it wasn't for the Electoral College, George W. Bush wouldn't have been president, and Donald Trump wouldn't have been president. And they're planning on using the Electoral College to make Trump president again.
So last week we hosted Yale med professor Dr. Bandy Lee, and she talked about her book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, basically saying he's mentally incapable of occupying the office that he currently occupies. We've got an election here in 2020. And of course, Tom, I want to get into some of the ways we can fix this system. But backtracking, are we basically looking at, for listeners to help understand and go out and get your book? Are we looking at the Buckley decision as being the main root of the problem, or being of who stole the vote? Who stole the vote in your mind, Tom?
Well, the Buckley decision would be more who stole the opinion, because basically it gave big money the power to influence elections. And it was Buckley and then Bellotti in 78, and then, of course, Citizens United in 2010 just pulled it all together and wrapped it in a bow and put a "we definitely agree with this" stamp on it. The who stole your vote stuff goes back to the 2002 Help America Vote Act, with the invention of a provisional ballot, which can be ignored by a Republican Secretary of State and not even open. So both those things need to be fixed, and both of those things were fixed in H.R. 1, the first piece of legislation that came out of the House of Representatives last year, the first year that Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House. It's a good, solid, comprehensive bill that got a little bit of Republican support, and it is sitting in the Senate now, where Mitch McConnell will not even allow it to be brought up for debate. There's obviously foreign money involved in this. Yes.
How does that get weeded out, Tom?
Well, in the Citizens United decision, in John Paul Stevens' dissent, he wrote that under this decision in World War II, had this decision been in effect during World War II, Tokyo Rose could have funded candidates for political office and would have had the right to broadcast her messages to our soldiers. She was the famous English language Japanese woman who was on the radio every day, all day, on not just on main frequencies, but also on radio, on air communication frequencies, telling our pilots to give up and the war is lost and all this kind of stuff. And Barack Obama, a few months after the decision, when he gave his State of the Union address in 2011, February 2011, he explicitly said from the podium that this Citizens United decision is going to bring foreign money into the elections. And of course, what's his name, the Supreme Court Justice in the front row, Sam Alito, mouthed, "You're wrong," or "is not," or something like that. Alito obviously was wrong. There's enormous amounts of foreign money coming into our elections. Seth Abramson, in his book Proof of Conspiracy, documented how tens of millions of dollars poured not just from Russia and Russian oligarchs, but also from Saudi Arabia oligarchs and the government of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates oligarchs and the government of UAE, and from Israeli oligarchs right into the Donald Trump campaign. And in some cases, the campaigns of individual members of the Congress. Mitch McConnell, for example, has been very heavily funded by Russian oligarchs and Ukrainian oligarchs, and which is one of the reasons they call him Moscow Mitch. This was all, essentially legalized with Buckley and Bellotti, but it was really officially legalized in 2010 with Citizens United.
Very interesting. So, Tom, what is your moving forward here for Americans? Obviously, the message is get out and vote. You can make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
What needs to happen to there was just the vote seems to be stolen by corporations on a basic level, gerrymandering. The banks are controlling the corporations. What's your take on moving forward in 2020? Obviously, we've got a very interesting state of politics in the country with the person that's currently occupying the office. How do we move forward here into the election cycle?
There's two things that I think we all need to do in addition to registering to vote and showing up. Even if you think you're in a state where it doesn't matter, the popular vote, even if it's not counted for president, you need to be voting for everybody down ticket. But secondly, we need those numbers. But mostly, we all know people who live in red states, in states where Republicans are secretaries of state, and they're aggressively purging the voter lists. And if you have any friends or relatives or neighbors or Facebook friends or whatever in a red state, you need to be sure to explain to them how important it is to double check their voter registration, which can be typically done online, at least every month, because these purges are going on every single day. That's just a constant rolling of these purges. And also you need to educate them about a provisional ballot. In previous elections, and the exit polls proved this, people thought that the provisional ballot was, no big deal. And but since then, so we need to get people so sensitized to provisional ballots, so upset about provisional ballots, that if they get one, that they'll start yelling and screaming and fighting and pull out a bullhorn and call 911 and call the local media and call some election protection people, because a provisional ballot in a red state is a ballot that will not be counted.
Yeah, Trump is basically, not to just harp on Trump here, but he is a term that resonates. He is a symptom, and he's a cause. And so the issue is, okay, obviously, how do we move forward? And these provisional ballots, it sounds like is a big thing, but we've got a system that's it's corrupt. It's not out of grasp in your opinion, Thom? You think it can be fixed?
Well, the Democratic Party is very committed to making voting a right, so that it's as hard for a state to take away your vote as it is for them to take away your gun. That they basically have to go to court to take away your vote.
Right.
And that's a good thing. The problem is the Democratic Party isn't in power, and the Republican Party does not want you to have a right to vote. And they aggressively fight it at the state level, at the federal level, even before the Supreme Court. And so, it's something we all need to work on. Yeah,
very sorry state of affairs. Thom, appreciate you joining the program. Give us a little insight into the next book that you've got coming up. Just give us a little bit of a tease.
Sure. I just finished the last edit of it yesterday. It's The Hidden History of Monopoly and the Death of the American Dream. And it's about how the average American family is paying about a $5,000 a year tax, a monopoly tax. For example, average cost of cell phone service in the United States is $70 to $80 a month. In France, it's $5 to $10 a month. In Germany, it's $12. In Spain, it's as much as $13 a month. Why? Because in those countries, they have multiple cell phone companies that compete. Here, we have an oligopoly. We've got 4 or 5 companies. Broadband service, typically in the United States, for 20 MIPS down and 1 MIP up of broadband service, you're spending between $75 and $100 a month. In France, that's, again, $15. In the UK, it's a little more. I think it's around $22. In Japan, it's $19. Airfare, we're paying at least a third more for airfare than people in any other developed country in the world pay. We pay more for food. We pay more for pretty much everything, and it's all because of these monopolies. It's much harder to start a new business in the United States now. The number of businesses listed on the New York Stock Exchange since 1980 has actually been cut in half. So because of this massive consolidation, there is not a single industry anywhere. Name your industry: travel, airfare, air travel, construction, hotels, restaurants. There pretty much is not an industry left in America that hasn't boiled down to about 4 or 5 companies operating in some cases with over 100 different brand names. About 80% of all the things in the supermarket come from fewer than 9 companies. That and 90% of our beer comes from 2 companies, and neither of them are American companies. Budweiser is no longer an American product, an American brand. So this is how these big corporations have just this is why they're able to extract an extra $5,000 a year from every American family, and it's why these CEOs and stockholders are fat and happy, and the stock market's going up, but all the rest of us are feeling screwed.
Yeah, Thom, beautiful topic. I can't wait for the release of this follow-up book. Both you're tackling some incredible topics here. I think one thing for listeners to think about here is, obviously, as inflation has gone up, and you're talking about the middle class here, right? That's really symbolic of innovation. Go ahead, and health and economy and that sort of thing. You've got to have a strong, healthy, large middle class that seems to be shrinking. And in regards to inflation, the average worker as you're saying, you just said we're all kind of getting the short end of the stick. That as the inflation is going up, the middle wage.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, the middle wage is staying
stagnant. These are all
stagnant.
changes that were made by Reagan. These are all changes that were made in corporate law by the Reagan administration in the 1980s. Up until the 1980s, we had a vibrant middle class and we had a vibrant small and middle-sized business ecosystem. There were a few large businesses, but the majority of business in America, both in total volume and numerically, were small and medium-sized businesses. Now, 40 some odd years after Reaganomics and after these changes in corporate law that were made by the Reagan administration, it's damn near impossible to start a successful small business. The main business model these days is start a company, build it up fast enough that you can sell it to one of the big guys before they squash you like a bug. Whereas it used to be, you'd start a dry cleaning store and then you pass it along to your kids. And, it would be in the family, or a furniture store or a hardware store to be in the family for 5 generations. That's all dead now. And we need to bring it back, and it's really not that big a deal to bring it back. It is going to be, there's going to be a lot of opposition to it.
Of course.
But basically, we've been here before. We were here in 1890 when the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed, and then in 1914 when the Clayton Antitrust Act was passed, and then in the 1950s when the anti-monopoly law was passed. And those were the things that kept the middle class strong and small business healthy and small and medium-sized businesses healthy. All that, like I said, got just torn asunder by Reagan, which is what produced that, if you're old enough to remember the 80s, the M&A explosion, the mergers and acquisitions explosion, the Michael Milkens, the guys who
right.
were
Sure. Just
the masters of the universe. And they were just slamming companies together and making big fees doing it. And if you take 2 companies and slam them together, you now no longer need 2 HR departments or 2 sales offices or 2 accounting offices. And so they were laying off huge numbers of people. And this is when this was the beginning of the massive deconstruction of the American middle class.
Yeah. Oh, unbelievable, Tom. Wonderfully said. Can't wait for that new book to come out, and can't wait to have you back on the program to discuss it. Some parting thoughts and some parting comments for listeners, Tom.
Well, I would say, number 1, be sure that you're registered to vote. Number 2, make sure that everybody you know is registered to vote, regularly checks it. I realize I'm being redundant, but this is such important stuff. And number 3, tell everybody what a placebo ballot, a provisional ballot is, and don't let, and tell them, do not accept one if it's given to you. And they will try to give it to you if you're in a college town or if you're in a community that's largely Black or Hispanic, and you're in a state controlled by the Republican Party. We've got to get some balance, some semblance of political balance back in the United States. You've got,
right.
In the Senate, you've got a Republican Party that represents about 30% of Americans now, that controls all the levers of power, because of this big state, small state thing. And, there's something we can do about that, too. That's in my voting book. We should admit Washington, D.C. as a state, give them 2 senators, and we should do the same thing with Puerto Rico. And that would sort of even the score a little bit.
Well, I like what I hear.
There's so much that we can do.
Yeah. And Tom, where can listeners find your daily? It's a daily radio program you've got, and where can they purchase your book?
Yeah. The books are available anywhere, any place that sells books. And the radio show, you can go to thomhartmann.com. However you spell it will get you there. We're on Sirius XM. We're on Dish and Direct TV on the Free Speech TV network. We're on a bunch of local stations around the country. We're on Pacifica stations as well as commercial stations. There's a list on our website.
Ladies and gentlemen, Thom Hartmann. Tom, thanks for rejoining Discuss Your Truth. Look forward to bringing you back on to talk about that next installment.
Thanks, Ian. I look forward to it, too. And thanks for having me on your show.
Thom Hartmann, if you're not familiar with his work, ThomHartmann, Thom Hartmann. Okay, it's double N at the end, Hartmann. You're going to find his stuff, and as you can tell, he's incredibly well researched. He knows exactly what he's talking about. He leans towards the Democratic Party, certainly not Republican. I try to stay level in my approach. there's what I say is that there's corruption certainly in both parties, but the bottom line here is that there are values, and you need to stand up for the values that you believe in. I mean, for instance, this is an incredibly wealthy country, a massive military, corporations that are all over the globe, obviously. Microsoft, Google, Apple, whatever it may be. The key, folks, is not money. The key is innovation. You're looking at the invention of the light bulb, the invention of the airplane, right? The radio, which I think is Marconi at Italy. The telephone, which the first transmission was there at Jekyll Island in Georgia, and that's another book I encourage you to get. The Creature from Jekyll Island, G. Edward Griffin, former guest on the program. Okay, but the issue here on many levels is banking, right? And how banking totally corrupts those veins of innovation, or rather, does it corrupt the veins of innovation? Okay, so Tom brought up Budweiser. It's owned by InBev. InBev is largely European, Brazilian, if not majority Brazilian. I'm not sure which one of the other, but it's not American. And so looking into some of these things is important. The United States is a great, great, great country. Keeping it great is the task here. And taking your vote away is how that country becomes weakened. Don't allow them to take your vote. Get out, stand up, and vote. Okay, just like, as I mentioned last week, if this program, if this information resonates with you, because you can see that the large media channels simply only try to sway your opinion and your thinking and your vote, which in my opinion they should not. Okay? Media should report and let you make your own opinion. They shouldn't be swaying you to make your opinion. They shouldn't be making your opinion for you. You need to be making your opinion off of facts. And that's why this program is Discussions of Truth. Because we look for the facts. Just give us the facts, man. Right? Okay. So, The Hidden History of War on Voting, Who Stole Your Vote and How to Get It Back. All right. Released February 11, 2020. You can find it in any bookstore. According to Tom, get it on Amazon, get Barnes & Noble, whatever it may be. Freedom Reserved, No More Lies, coming your way. That's a quick read, coming your way. It's 300 and something pages, 62 I think it is, coming your way April 23rd, and you can order it now, pre-order on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. If you're outside the United States, you can get it at Chapters in the UK, you can get it in Canada, you can get it in the UK, you can get it in Denmark, you can get it in Australia. All right, that is my book, releasing in April 2020, so just a few weeks away. Folks, this has been another edition of Discuss Your Truth every Wednesday, 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard. I'm coming your way. We are now starting to pick up double headers, okay? We're booked all the way into all through May and coming up on June, so we've got an incredible slate next week, bringing Kevin Shipp your way, and Bandy Lee will be rejoining the program April 8th. Okay, one of the big things to consider, of course, if you're interested in the pharmaceutical industry, is Gerald Posner, former Wall Street attorney. He'll be talking about his 3-time New York Times bestseller. Talking about his book, Pharma. All right, we've got a lot of great guests continuing to come your way. Buy a t-shirt, No More Lies, stopmassmedia.com. That's what it says. You can find it at iantrottier.com, INTROTTIER.com. Stop Mass Media, streaming live, always Wednesday, 5 o'clock. Listen to us, subscribe to us, to me on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, whatever it may be. Until next week, folks. If you do nothing else in your day, then certainly strive to be awesome.